I'm originally from a major city in southern Ohio, and outside of town, there are a number of smaller townships. One of these is known as the more country bumpkin redneck part of town. It's not even in the same county, but it's part of the general area of my city. In the woods there is a legend of Hell's Church. Supposedly an old church that burned down where Satanists would perform rituals, or a Satanist church that burned down by a ritual, depending on who you ask. There are a number of these Hell's Church stories in Ohio, and many different places, but this one was closest to us, and a number of my friends decided they wanted to be ghost hunters and check out haunted places around where we lived. We were juniors in high school, and while all of us obviously thought this was just stupid bullshit, we thought it would be amusing to go out and scare ourselves. Plus, most of us had cars and driver's licenses by now, so we were enjoying a new burst of freedom. Now, I'm kind of a scaredy cat about most stuff like this. I was the most tomboyish girl of the group, and kind of just wanted to hang out with the guys. Plus, there were some other girls in the group that were tagging along, so I didn't want to be the one who looked like a loser or a pussy. So one day in November, we decided that we were going to go out one night and try to find this Hell's Church. We had actually been to this location once before that fall, but one of my friends had a curfew, so after exploring an old barn and the railroad tracks on a bridge nearby, we had to leave. Much to the group's disappointment, and to my mild relief, we didn't locate the church, which supposedly had rotted down to a chimney at this point. We took 2 cars out there, going past the more populated parts of our city and back towards this forested area. I can't honestly tell you how we got there, but I do know that it's off of a state highway, then down an abandoned access road, past some old warehouses, and finally down a dirt road. Once you get down the dirt road, there is a kind of thicker part of the road early on where we parked the cars off the shoulder. We did this because the road eventually thins out, and it becomes impossible to drive down. And also, someone clearly owns this land, as there were no trespassing signs posted. I'm sure a ton of kids go back here, so it didn't seem odd that somebody wanted this place blocked off. At the time, I didn't really think much into it. We got out of the cars and began walking down the dirt road, wandering off the path from time to time, to check out some barns in the clearings where we thought the chimney might be. Some of them were filled with spray-painted symbols and other bullshit. But that's not what really bothered us. There was also other stuff like dead owls that looked like they had been eviscerated, though they appeared to be dried out and decomposed for some time. Thank God. There were other bits that looked like they may have come off from animals. I was grossed out. But we all kind of agreed that this could have been the work of some teenagers attempting some kind of satanic ritual, or some of these animals had gotten trapped in the old barn and died there, only to be picked apart by other animals later on. The guys were now desperately trying to find this stupid chimney, so they kept taking off through the trees into the clearings. Myself and the other 2 girls who were there just sort of hung back, getting a little more nervous and a little more irritated with the guys who continued to come up empty-handed. As we kept going, we found a bike in the tree line, like a bike that maybe a 12-year-old would ride. It was out of place and a bit creepy, but whatever. It probably belonged to someone who owned the property. We decided that we're just going to go a bit further, and soon we found another bicycle. This one was a bit older, a little rusted. It looked too small to be an adult-sized bike. We didn't want to talk too much about the other bike that we saw. We just kept shrugging it off, ignoring the possible implications. That was until one of the guys said, "These kids probably got murdered by the same freaks who were cutting up those animals back there." It was entirely possible, but nobody was really having any of it. By this point, we had been out there for almost 2 hours, and it was getting late. Plus, I think we were all a bit more creeped out than we wanted to admit. We decided to head back to the cars, and I felt instantly relieved, very happy that I was finally heading back home. But things never work out that way, do they? By the cars, we saw a road that went straight up a hill, through the trees. At the start of it, there was a big metal gate that had a road closed sign on it. We had seen this before, but it never occurred to us that we should try to go up that road. After a small debate by the gate, we eventually decided to go for it. I didn't want to, but apparently I was on the losing side, so there wasn't a lot I could do about it. We climb over the gate and start up the hill, where an old cracked pavement road crumbled under our feet. Along with the poor road conditions, there were a bunch of trees that had fallen onto the path, blocking off the road from any cars passing through. Some of us started to seriously question if we should be doing this, arguing that someone obviously wanted to keep us out of here, but we just got made fun of for being afraid and kept going. I couldn't see where the road ended. We had flashlights, but they weren't doing us much good, and the trees made it hard to see. All of a sudden, the road ended. The trees opened up off of an incline to a flat field. What a sight that was. It was a flat field with tall grass on either side, probably 2 or 3 feet high. The path that we were on extended into the field. It eventually led to a cul-de-sac of 3 buildings. 2 of them looked like they were farmhouses, and the other looked to be another old barn. All 3 of the buildings were made of wood, and they looked like they had been mostly weathered and stripped by time. As soon as I saw the 3 buildings, I was done, and I wanted nothing more than to just get out of there, as did the other 2 girls in the group and one other guy, who decided that he had enough himself. The 4 of us stayed behind while the other 3 guys went to go check out the buildings. And while we didn't want to be out in this field, in the open, we decided that we couldn't just leave them. At this point, we turned off our flashlights. While the 4 of us waited, we started bitching about how stupid our friends were and making small talk. None of us said it, but we were all looking to the grass every now and again, worried that something was going to jump out at us. The setting was just so creepy. It felt like our friends were gone forever. We did see them get to the first building and go inside. We then saw the flicker of the flashlights in the windows, and I just remember feeling so tense. It was like watching a horror film in real life. Maybe after about 10 minutes, we see one of our friends coming toward us, lightly jogging, looking afraid for the first time all night. "You idiots went inside?" I asked. He just looks at us and says, "Yeah, it was full of bikes. Just bikes chained to the walls." We didn't believe him and kept waiting for him to say that it was a joke, but he insisted. Eventually the other 2 came back and reiterated they were just storing a bunch of bikes in these buildings, most of them being smaller. They all looked afraid, and as much as I did not want to believe them, I did. They aren't the kind of guys to pull a prank this elaborate. By then, we all agreed that we had to get out of there, and we started down the hill, going as fast as we could. All of a sudden, about halfway down, we see a pair of headlights about where our cars were parked. They slowly passed by, and we knew that they were looking for us. Because we were so far off the beaten path, we figured one of 2 things. They were the cops, and we were going to be busted for trespassing. Or they were the people who own this land. So A, arrested, or B, murdered. We knew that the road didn't go on for much longer from where the cars were parked, so they would be turning around soon. And since our cars were parked right there, they would probably be waiting for us. We were all whispering about this as we picked up the pace, sprinting down the hill as fast as we could. I'm not a good runner, but I was hauling ass, keeping up with the rest of the group, and basically hurtling over the fallen trees. Once we got down the hill, we didn't see any headlights, but we knew that they couldn't be that far away. "Hurry up and get in the cars," one of our friends yells. In typical horror film fashion, we were fumbling with the doors, too nervous to even think straight. And as soon as we start the cars up, we see the headlights speeding down the road. A giant black truck came speeding towards us. The truck seemed larger than life, raised up off the ground. We put the pedal to the metal and peeled out of there. The truck was still following us, tailgating the car, almost as if they were trying to run us off the road. We were all screaming, looking back at the truck, fighting for some distance. Once we got back to the highway, we were switching lanes, trying to escape. Luckily, we were in sedans, so it was easy for us to weave in and out of the other cars. But the truck still pursued us. Both of our sedans were in 2 different lanes, but we didn't want to get too far away from our friends. The passengers of both cars were texting back and forth, trying to make a plan. It took us about 15 minutes to finally lose the truck. I'm not sure if the distance was too much, or if they just gave up and turned around. But once we got to the big shopping center area, we ducked off the road and into a Sonic parking lot. We all sat in our cars for a bit, watching to make sure that we didn't get snuck up on. It took us a while to settle down enough to head home. Everyone was pretty shaken up, even the guys who had tried to act tough the entire time. During what was a pretty quiet car ride, exhaustion and lingering fear took over. We didn't talk about it again for a long time, and we never called the police. Which, honestly, looking back as an adult, we should have. I don't think about it often, only during the fall. But when I do, I have to ask myself, who chased us that night? Why were all those buildings abandoned? Who owned those bikes? And where are they now? This is an experience that I still struggle with to this day. I'm an 80s kid, and I grew up in Georgia. My old man was a master sergeant in the Air Force, and my mom was a nurse at the local hospital. There were many times that my older half-sister had to babysit my younger sister and me. Since I was a bit older than my little sister, I spent most of the time riding bicycles around the neighborhood with my friends, climbing trees, and exploring the forest near our home. Usual kid stuff. On occasion, when we had a bit of money, me and my friends would ride to the grocery store to buy some candy and soda. On these occasions, we would leave our bikes in the alley between the bowling alley and the grocery store, next to the discarded shipping crates. On the day in question, me and my friends Jamie, Tommy, Danny, and Charles were out riding our bikes like any other day. We rode through the forest trails, then decided to go grab some drinks to combat the summer heat. We rode up to the store, stashed our bikes, and went inside and got our drinks. We came back out and sat in the shipping crates, chatting and laughing while we stuffed our faces with candy and Dr. Pepper. A short time later, Danny and Jamie took off for home, while Charles, Tommy, and I stayed behind. We wanted to hang out a bit more before we left. Then, someone emerged from the side entrance. The man then came over to us and started talking. "Hey guys, how's it going?" He seemed okay, at first, until he pushed Tommy and me inside one of the shipping crates and closed the door. He then pinned the container against the opposite wall, trapping us. He then shoved Charles to the ground. Charles then jumped on his bike and left us behind. "Looks like your friend ditched you. Let me share a little secret with you too. I've been watching you for a while. Coming back here, sitting in these crates, you all are like little mice." I stared up at the man from inside the crate. His once friendly face now donned an expression that can only be described as pure evil. The man then looked me dead in the eyes. "I know who you are, where you live, who your parents are." The man then lifted his shirt, revealing a pistol. "If you boys behave yourselves, I won't have to use this." This next part is quite upsetting for me to relay. The man opened the crate and pulled out Tommy. And I think you can probably guess what he did to Tom. I watched on, helpless, still trapped inside the shipping crate. The man threw Tom to the ground and then turned to look at me. The man was very big, muscular, and covered in biker tattoos. There was absolutely nothing we could do to fight him off. I couldn't fight him off. When he was done with me, he stood up and said, "Remember, boys, I know where you live. If you tell anyone about this, I'll know where to find you." He then began laughing as he disappeared down the alley. We collected ourselves and took off for home. Being the clueless 9-year-olds we were, we believed the man's threats and about him knowing where we lived, so we didn't tell our parents. Charles did, though. His mom called the police, and the next day we found out that the man had been arrested for assault from when he pushed Charles down. It turns out that the man was an employee at the store. The police never spoke to us, though. That monster only spent 45 days in jail and was released back out into our neighborhood. 6 months after his release, Charles was riding up to the store by himself. The man had been fired, and Charles was completely unaware of what happened to Tommy and me. Someone shot Charles in the back of the head while he was heading back to his house. This had never happened in our town before. The entire community was shaken, and this time, the police spoke to everyone. When they questioned me, I broke down. I was terrified. I told them about what happened to Tommy and me behind the grocery store. I told them about the threats. Unfortunately, by the time I spilled the beans to the police, it was too late. The man had skipped town, and the last time anyone saw him was the night that Charles was killed. I will end things on a bittersweet note. No arrest was ever made, because the man took his own life 2 years later. This happened when I was about 7. My sister was 9 at the time. It was a very different world back in the 80s. My sister and I were allowed to walk to the park alone as long as we stayed together. We did this all the time and never had an issue until that day. There was a playground that sat adjacent to the baseball field. Beyond the baseball diamond, you could see the forest that bordered our neighborhood, the only landmark being a massive boulder outside the tree line. We were the only ones in the park that day, playing on the monkey bars. I remember seeing a figure standing at the edge of the woods as it moved toward the boulder. As I focused my vision, I could see that it was a man with no shirt on. He looked like he was out of shape, and he had long, messy hair that fell to his shoulders. I honestly couldn't tell if he was wearing any pants or not. When he noticed me looking at him, he beckoned for me to come over. My big sister immediately said, "Don't you dare go over there. Stay away from him." I might have been just a kid back then, but my dad always taught us about stranger danger. We ran all the way back home and told our dad what happened. He called the police right away and reported it. A police officer showed up a short time later. After we told our story, the officer turned to my dad and said, "You know kids, they sometimes make stories up." I was absolutely crushed that the officer did not believe us. After he left, Dad said, "Don't worry, I believe you." From that day on, he would walk us to the park himself. Thankfully, we never saw that man again. However, 2 kids from a nearby neighborhood did go missing around the same time. When the news broke, I saw a sketch that was made of a suspicious man wearing no shirt who was seen in the area where the kids were shortly before they went missing. It was the same guy. I honestly don't know what became of the missing kids. My parents shielded us from stuff like that, especially after what happened at the park. Who knows what could have happened to me and my sister if that man managed to snatch us up. Before I end this story, I just want to say that I'm not someone who hates cops, but that day, they got it wrong. This happened when I was 14. I was home alone one weekend while my parents were at a work convention out of state. I was in my bedroom playing Rocket League with two of my friends. To clarify, they weren't in the room with me. I was talking to them on my headset. During the game, I heard a thump from downstairs. This wasn't unusual because I have two cats who wrestle each other sometimes, and they often make a lot of noise while they're doing it. So I assumed that's what it was and resumed my game, but I slightly turned down the volume to hear if the noise persisted. 2 minutes later, I hear another thump, followed by what sounded like a grunt. Hang on, guys. I think I hear something downstairs. Go check it out. We'll be here when you get back. I began to make my way downstairs, thinking that my cats were wrestling rougher than they usually do. But as I got about halfway, I froze. I could hear what sounded like men whispering to each other, coming from the living room. I crouched down to get a small peek into the living room and saw 3 men, dressed in black. I felt my chest sink in when I saw them. I slowly went back upstairs, and of course, like in a typical horror film, the very last step made a loud creak. The entire house went silent. I knew that they heard it. Thinking on my feet, I quietly went to my room and threw on my headset. Guys, I need you to call 911. There are 3 men inside my house. What? Look, I don't have time to explain. Just call the cops and send them to my house right now. I'm being 100% serious. I then threw my headset on the bed. I could hear footsteps coming up the stairs. I had to think fast. I knew that if I locked myself inside my room, they would know where I was. So I closed the door and snuck over to my parents' room, leaving the door open so they wouldn't think to check it. I know the logic is flawed, but I had to think fast. 5 seconds later, I heard a pair of heavy boots hit the wooden floor, accompanied by 2 more sets. I then heard them get louder as they came down the hall and stopped outside my bedroom. I heard pounding on my bedroom door, followed by a deep voice saying,
"Open up, kid, before I kick this door down."
I lost my nerve and made a rash decision. I made a break from my parents' bedroom window and slid it open. I must have made a lot of noise while I was doing it, because I heard the footsteps coming towards my parents' bedroom now. I looked over my shoulder and saw a dark figure appear in the doorway.
"Get back here!"
The man yelled as he ran towards me. At this point, I tried jumping out of the window, but the man grabbed one of my ankles. Luckily, I was able to move my feet and slip out of my shoe, and I fell onto the small roof above my back porch. The man at the window jumped after me. I remember seeing a pair of boots coming right at me. I swear the man's feet would have gone right through me if I hadn't rolled off the roof at the last second. I landed awkwardly on my left ankle, but otherwise, I was okay. During all the commotion, one of the men ran downstairs to cut me off. Limping on one foot, I made it to the backyard gate before the man grabbed me and threw me to the ground. I tried to yell, but the man covered my mouth with his hand as the 2 other men climbed down from the window. The 3 of them began pulling me back into the house. But before they could get me through the door, I heard the sound of police sirens closing in. The men all looked at each other. Shit! They dropped me and ran towards the back gate. I limped my way to the front door and yanked it open and yelled at the police officers. Hey, they're in the backyard. 3 of the officers ran towards the backyard, while another helped me to one of the police cars. They managed to catch one of the assailants, while the other 2 made it over the fence. They threw the man into one of the cruisers as I was giving my statement. Soon, the 2 friends I was playing online with pulled into the driveway on their bikes. Hey Gabe, are you okay? Yeah, I'm alright. Thanks for calling the cops for me. The man that was caught was charged with burglary and attempted kidnapping. It turns out that the men broke through the basement window. I'm thankful that I managed to escape with only a sprained ankle. My lesson to everyone listening is to always follow your gut and never ignore any sounds you hear while you're home alone. This happened to me several years ago while I was serving as a missionary. It is one of the scariest experiences of my life and has made me appreciate what we refer to as our gut feeling. For some context, I was in a rural county of northern Georgia. 5 of my friends and I received a call from our church to go to the house of a close friend and help them out with some yard work. Being young volunteer missionaries, we jumped at the opportunity. The location was so far off the reservation that it wasn't even considered a town. It was more of a neighborhood with huge houses surrounded by forest. To this day, that place doesn't even come up on Google Maps. After an hour of driving, we arrived at the house and were greeted by a woman who I will call Linda. She told us to drive further up the hill. So we drove up the paved road that looked like an escape maze from a kid's menu. We arrived at the top of the hill and parked the car. The entire property was littered with heaps of trash and abandoned trailers. It looked like a tornado had stopped by for a visit to do some exterior decorating. Imagine the TV show Hoarders, but rather than just one house, it was an entire acre of property in shambles. The woman's sister, Sherry, who had previously owned this property, was not there. It was just Linda and her husband Brett. She told us that we were doing this without her sister's knowledge. Her sister was a hoarder and a serious drug addict. She told us to throw everything we saw into a giant metal trash container. We felt uneasy doing this without permission, but we didn't think much of it. I wish I had listened to my gut feeling. Linda told us to clear out everything we saw before her sister got there. Linda had bought the property back from her sister and was due to have a lease in a couple of weeks. Linda and her husband left, and we got started. I won't go into the cleaning process as there isn't much to mention. There were 3 abandoned trailers within 50 feet of each other, so we were all within sight. I was the type to explore abandoned places when given the opportunity, and I decided to be adventurous and go to the back of the first trailer, out of sight of my friends. I get back there, and there is so much trash continuing to pile up towards the hill's incline, and the back door of the trailer was wide open. I started to walk towards it. As I approached, I noticed that there was trash piled up to the ceiling, yet there was a walkway to get around inside the trailer. As I got about 5 feet away, I stopped. Something in my gut told me to run out of there immediately. So I did just that. When I returned, Sherry was now back on the property. I had been gone for maybe about 5 minutes or so. I didn't hear her car pulling up. She literally came out of nowhere. Whatever mental image you may have about Sherry is probably accurate. I mean, who chooses to live in a literal dump in the middle of nowhere? I'll answer that. The same kind of person who immediately goes inside the metal container and starts throwing stuff back out into the yard.
How dare you throw away my stuff? There is valuable treasure in here.
We all just stood there, slack-jawed. Linda soon pulls up and begins arguing with her sister.
Sherry, this is my property now, and all this has to go.
I told you I'd start going through it when I had the chance.
We both know that that's not going to happen.
Yeah. We decided then that it was best to just leave. Now, you might be wondering why I'm sharing this story if there was only a little bit of family drama. Well, I wish I could tell you. That's where things ended. 3 days later, there was an older gentleman from our congregation who wanted to meet up with us for dinner. It was his way of saying thank you for helping him out on his own property. We met up with him and his brother Carl at a huddle house. Carl then filled us in about what happened after we left that day. The two sisters had a serious falling out. Linda ended up calling the cops after she saw someone inside one of the trailers. After the police arrived, they found several squatters inside the trailers.
They've been living there for several weeks. They were definitely there when y'all was there.
When he said this, my heart froze. I realized that when I had ventured off, none of my friends knew. I was mere feet away from potentially walking into multiple squatters. Since that time, I have become proficient with several styles of martial arts. However, at the time, I had barely started training, and I wouldn't have stood a chance against one squatter, let alone multiple. They were likely watching us from the windows that day, and they could have surprised me with a hammer and dragged my body off into the woods. I'm grateful that I listened to my gut feeling when it mattered the most, and I recommend everyone listening to do the same. There are only a few moments in your life that will shake you to your core, leaving you completely traumatized. This story is of one such occurrence. This took place in my home country of India. It was the winter of 2020. I was 19 years old. Due to the ongoing lockdowns that were happening at the time, some of my close friends and I decided to meet up for a small party. After discussing it with the group, it was agreed that the party would be held at my best friend's house. Her name is Anita. Anita's mother welcomed us with dinner and a bottle of wine for a Christmassy kind of celebration. Later on, we were watching a movie and having a pretty good time, but Anita's inebriation was becoming noticeable. How could a small amount of wine do that? She must be a major lightweight, I thought. But it turns out that each time she went to the bathroom, she was secretly drinking some rum that she had kept hidden. I guess she didn't want to share with the rest of us. After a while, Anita got a call from her boyfriend and went out to the balcony to talk. Even with the movie sounds, we could hear her cursing violently about something. She then stumbled back into the room, and we all looked at her, concerned. Anita seemed to be staring at me with a certain look that could almost be described as hatred. But a moment later, that look vanished, and she smiled. "Is everything okay, Anita?" "Oh, it's nothing. My boyfriend was supposed to meet me tomorrow, but he won't be able to make it." "Oh, that's too bad. Why don't you come watch the rest of the movie with us?" As we watched the movie, I saw out of the corner of my eye, Anita was staring at me with that same hateful look. I concluded that she was just drunk. Oh boy, was I wrong. After the movie, she requested that I stay over since I was her best friend. The others left, and it was now just me and Anita. After some girly conversations, we both went to bed. I don't know how long I had been sleeping for, but I woke up with a searing pain in the left side of my chest. For a moment, I thought I was having a heart attack. I felt my chest, and I soon realized that I was bleeding. I had been stabbed. Before I could scream, Anita quickly clamped my mouth shut. "So my piece of shit boyfriend has a thing for you. I hate you so much," She then raised the knife in her hand for a second time, but this time I blocked it with my hand, resulting in my left palm being stabbed. Thankfully, I was much bigger than Anita, so I pushed her off of me with all of my strength and screamed at the top of my lungs. There was a struggle, but I was finally able to subdue her. By that time, her parents were banging on the door. Her father eventually kicked it in and switched on the light. They froze on the spot after they saw me covered in blood. As we waited for the police, the ambulance, and my parents to come, Anita went completely insane and began screaming at me. Unbeknownst to me, Anita was diagnosed with schizophrenia and had to be placed on strong medications. In India, mental disorders are still a taboo topic, so many of her family members never told anyone about her condition, which is severely irresponsible. She was not convicted of a crime because of her condition, but she was sent to an institution for testing and treatment. As for me, the knife had missed my heart by only a few inches, and I stayed in the hospital for about a week, though it took nearly 2 months to fully recover. I still get nightmares about what happened, and I've never gone to a sleepover since that night. This didn't happen to me. This is my mother's experience. I'll give you some background before we get into the incident. My mother was 11 years old at the time, living in the same bedroom that I currently live in. Our house is very old and is located in a very secluded area. The nearest neighbor is at least 5 miles away. The bedroom faces the backyard, which is inaccessible from the front yard unless you scale a metal fence. Now on to the night in question. I will tell the rest of the story from my mother's perspective. One night at about 2 a.m., I was sleeping in my bedroom when I was woken up by the sound of scratching on my window. It sounded like the branches from a nearby tree were rubbing against the screen of my window. I tried to ignore it, but the noise persisted. It kept happening in intervals, with about 10 seconds in between. Then I realized something. There were no trees or bushes by my window. There were some along the other side of the house, but not where my room is. That's when I decided to get out of bed and take a look. I stood there listening, terrified to see what was behind the blinds. I gathered up as much courage as possible and yanked the blinds back. A tall figure stood on the other side, wearing a Jason Voorhees hockey mask. I was frozen in fear. I then noticed a knife in the man's hand that he had been rubbing against the screen. We looked at each other for what felt like hours, when suddenly the man turned around and ran away, disappearing into the forest. Once I snapped out of my trance, I screamed bloody murder and ran to go get my father. He ran outside with a shotgun and tried to find the man, but he was long gone. I still have no idea if it was a prank or if he planned on entering the house and lost his nerve once he saw me. Keep in mind that our house is in the middle of nowhere, so the implication is that either some lunatic was wandering around the forest in a hockey mask, or someone traveled a very long distance just to pull a prank. Needless to say, this shook us up for a while. If someone was indeed watching our house, there were plenty of places for them to hide. But thankfully, nothing like that ever happened again. This happened a long time ago, in the late 1990s. When I was 19, I moved from Oregon to Florida to be with my boyfriend at the time. Don't ever do that. I was thinking white sand beaches and Mickey Mouse, but instead I got the swamp, bugs, and dirt roads. It was a huge shock to the system. We lived in a small town called Hawthorne, just outside of Gainesville. Don't ever go there. It was very small, had one stoplight and 4 stores, which were Dollar General, Steve's Market, Eckerd's Pharmacy, and Sonny's Barbecue. I got a job at the now defunct Eckerd's, in the middle of the town. It was right next to the grocery store, so everybody shopped there. After about 3 months or so of working there, I walked in to start my shift one day, when the manager pulled me into his office. Laid out on his desk was about 30 to 40 opened letters, all addressed by hand. To me. Would you happen to know who's writing you all these letters? No, I have no idea. Here, read one. I picked a cheerful-looking yellow one. Inside were 2 handwritten letters, and a magazine cutout of a woman with blonde hair, just like me. My manager watched on as I read the letter. I skipped around a lot out of confusion, desperately trying to find out why I'm in this room. From what I read, it was mostly someone imagining what spending time with me would be like. A lot of it was of a sexual nature. There were descriptions and comments about my hair, about washing it, smelling it, and something about moonlight. A few sentences were highlighted, while others were underlined. My first thought was, am I getting fired? My manager then asked, do you know this David Elrod? Yeah, I think so. He's a regular who comes in a couple times a week to pick up Diet Coke and medication for his mom. David was in his late 20s, tall, lanky guy with thick glasses and frizzy blonde hair, and was obviously very socially awkward and possibly mentally challenged. On rare occasions, he would make small talk as I rang up his soda. Once or twice, he would linger at my cash register or stare at me. But I figured he was trying to adjust his eyes, or had poor social skills, harmless compared to some other people I've met in Florida, so I didn't pay him any mind. That was until that day in my manager's office. I knew that he was the one writing the letters because of a strange encounter I had with him about 2 weeks prior. While working, he came up behind me and caressed my hair. I had to remove it from his hands, and he apologized. It was weird, but no harm done. I went right back to work. After telling my manager this, he informed me that the customer was going to be banned from the store, and I was going to be sent home while they worked out the details. Confused, I walked out of the store and drove home. It was a strange day, to say the least. 2 hours after I got back home from my non-shift at work, there was a knock at my door. I look out the window and see what resembles a SWAT team. What the fuck? I saw men in tactical gear, brandishing large weapons. There were 2 men dressed in suits, and several uniformed cops. In what seemed like slow motion at the time, I opened the door. An officer held up a few oddly familiar letters. Excuse me, can we come in and talk to you about these? Realizing everyone in town has read the letters, I was so embarrassed that I just wanted to pass the fuck out. I didn't even know the guy. We sat on my couch and the officer begins to speak. Out of the corner of my eye, I see my boyfriend shooting me dirty looks from the bedroom. The officer mentioned that they got the letters from the pharmacy and were attempting to issue a trespassing notice against David. The officers confronted him at his residence. Apparently, he was not happy about this. He insisted for over 45 minutes how this was all a big mistake and that I wanted to talk to him. He was very combative and persistent, so they decided to pursue stalking charges. But it turns out the story gets even more strange and horrifying. The officer continued, "You need to be aware of something. David killed and partially dismembered his mother when he was 12 years old. He was released from a juvenile psychiatric facility less than 4 years ago. We found very disturbing materials at his house. We believe that he's been stalking you for quite some time. His mom has been dead for years, and he's still coming to my store and picking up her medication and Diet Coke. I remember that he would often say,
It's my mom's favorite drink.
David was arrested the next day for stalking after he was found in the Eckarts parking lot. The last thing I ever heard about him was that he was readmitted to the psychiatric hospital, at least temporarily. I didn't have a chance to read all the letters in full before they were entered into some vault of evidence, nor do they explain what they found at the house. So I never had the full scale of what was happening. My boyfriend at the time was a huge dick about the whole thing, so I moved back to Oregon a week later. Besides, he wants to hang around when Norman Bates is fixated on you. So a little background here. My father was in the Army for 21 years, retired, and moved to a very small town in Central Florida. He got bored after a couple of years, and even though we didn't need the money, between his retirement pension and my mom making what she did as a bookkeeper, he wanted to go back to work. He started working at various gas stations, and with it being a small town, the owners didn't care if I came there and helped him out with stocking the coolers or even running the register, as long as I didn't sell any beer or smokes. This took place in the year 1990. I remember the date well, because it was shortly after my 15th birthday, and I had just gotten my learner's permit. My dad would let me drive him to and from work, just to get some experience on the road, both day and night. I was sitting at my usual spot at the table that was set up along the windows. I was reading a book, with my feet propped up and a Mountain Dew on the table alongside some snacks. I would generally spend most of the evenings that way, reading books, getting up to run the register, or stocking the coolers at different times. I remember glancing up because something had caught my attention that was unusual. I realized that a lady was walking up our parking lot from the direction of the interstate. The gas station was right on I-75. This in itself was very strange. Because of where we were located, you didn't get many people walking there, and definitely not walking from the direction of the interstate. I figured that she had broken down somewhere and was coming in to use the phone to call for a tow truck or something. But I was completely wrong. She came into the store and looked around for a few minutes. I remember getting this strange and creepy feeling about her. She walked up to the counter and started telling my dad a story about how she had gotten stranded and needed a ride to the town just north of us. She was referring to Ocala. My dad lets her know that he's working right now and there's no way that he can take her. She turns and looks at me, and while she's looking away from my dad, he catches my eye and subtly shakes his head no. I was confused for a second, but she then turns back to my dad and points at me, asking me if I can take her. My dad cut in and said I only had a learner's permit and that I wouldn't be able to drive her anywhere. Normally, I would have done it, even though it's illegal, because I had done it a few times before already. I didn't argue with my dad, since this was completely out of character for him. He was normally chatty with the customers, but for whatever reason, he was almost curt and dismissive of her. It turns out he had a bad vibe the moment he had seen her walking up the drive. She cursed him out for a minute, and then he basically told her to get out of the store. She opened up the door and stormed out. I thought the glass was going to break from how hard she slammed it shut. She then walked out of the store, down the driveway, and I continued to watch as she made her way back up to the interstate, and then up the northbound ramp. Almost a year later, I'm in my bedroom. It was less than a week before my 16th birthday. I hear my dad yelling from the living room, "Son, get your ass in here and look at this." I quickly run to the living room, and I see my dad pointing at the TV, and I look at the mugshot of the lady that was on screen. I immediately remembered the lady who had been in the store. It turns out I almost gave a ride to Eileen Warnos, who was later convicted of being a serial murderer, and then later was put to death. I still have nightmares about what could have happened if I had given her a ride. I am a proud Floridian. At the time of this story, early 2000s, I was going to college in South Florida, and I lived with my family in my hometown located in the Panhandle. It's about a 7-hour drive up through Central Florida to get between my school and my house, so I mostly went home just for the holidays. It was the Thanksgiving of my junior year, and I was excited that I had been able to rearrange my midterms to be able to leave campus 3 days ahead of everyone else. I was expecting to beat the masses of traffic, and I was hoping for a quick trip back home. My roommates wanted to have one last meal together before we all left for break. So we all met up at the campus dining hall around 4 p.m., and I set off on my journey around 5:30. Around 10 p.m., I was just a bit more than halfway there. I always stopped at this mom and pop kind of diner by the side of the highway to grab some food, use the restroom, and called my dad to let him know that I was okay. I didn't have a cell phone back then. Well, I hadn't been through here since summer, and unfortunately the place went out of business. So, a bit bummed out that I wasn't going to be able to get my chocolate chip pancakes, I just kept going. There really wasn't much build up around there at the time, so when I saw signs for a rest stop in, of all places on God's green earth, some bumfuck town called Alachua, I went and parked directly under the streetlight for safety and used the facilities, called my dad on the payphone, etc. I didn't see anyone else there, except for a very exhausted-looking woman, who asked me for directions, saying that she was with her husband and 2 small children, and they had made a wrong turn trying to get to Disney. Alachua is about 150 miles from Disney World. So I left the rest area and was walking back to my car when I noticed a beat-up, unmarked bluish-gray work van parked very close to the driver's side door of my '95 Honda Civic. I thought, yeah, okay, that's pretty weird. Of course, it had Florida tags on it. So it couldn't have been the lady I talked to before. I distinctly remember she said she was from Virginia. I turned around and hightailed it back to the rest stop, promptly running into some random middle-aged guy who had 2 little boys with him. It turns out that it was his wife that I had spoken to before. She emerged from the bathroom a second later. I told him what was going on with the van and how I didn't know what to do. He said that he would go and check it out. So he left the kids with his wife, then walked up to the driver's side door of the van. He stood there for a moment before speaking. His voice awkwardly quivered, but I could hear him yelling from where we were standing, about 100 feet away.
Excuse me, gentlemen. We've already called the police, so I'm going to have to politely suggest that you get out of here.
He then ran back to us, grabbed his wife and kids, and pointed to me with a swift,
You, come on, let's get in the car, now.
And we all ran back to his car together. Very confused, sitting in the back seat of a stranger's SUV, while he went and used the payphone, presumably to call the police. Meanwhile, the van pulled out of there. I had never seen someone get the fuck out of there quite like they got the fuck out of there. They ran up onto the curb on their way out. They burned rubber. It was almost comical. The cops got there and I found out what happened. The man went to go check out the van, and he could see inside pretty well, because I had parked under the streetlight. The first thing he noticed was that all the seats except for the driver's seat had been removed. There was someone sitting in the driver's seat, and another guy hiding in the back, with a tarp laid out, and a bunch of other random items back there that I couldn't immediately identify. Neither of the men were reading a newspaper or a map. They were both apparently just sitting there, waiting. Still makes me sick just thinking about it. Thank you for watching. If you have a story that you would like to share on this channel, please send it to my email, unit522stories@outlook.com. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button when notifications turned on. You can further support my channel by visiting the merch store. A link for that is in the description. You'll be hearing from me soon. Until next time, I'm your Uncle Unit, and as always, never forget. There's always